Good morning, guys. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So today we are going to discuss a few important concepts of entity framework like what are eager loading, lazy loading, and explicit loading, right? So you already know these things, but let us explore more about these things. So first of all, if someone asks you in how many ways we can load the related entities in entity framework, basically the answer is in three ways. We can load the related entities in entity framework in three ways, and the ways are eager loading, lazy loading, and explicitly loading. All these three terms, right, that is eager, lazy, and explicitly, are referring to the process of loading the entities, right? The process of loading the entities means they will define when to load the related entities of a child entity, right? So as we are mentioning loading the related entities or child entities, first of all, we need to understand what do we mean by related entity or child entity, right? If you go to if you go to the student model class or any model class, right, which is created by entity framework, and if you check, right, there might be some navigation properties, right? And in this student class you can see there are three navigation property. One is student, another is student address, another is courses. This student and student address, these two are nothing but your reference navigation property, and this courses is nothing but your collection navigation property. How these properties are created based on the one-to-one and one-to-many relationships, right? So, what is this? Now, this means if we are creating multiple tables based by relating the tables with the primary key or unique key and foreign key relationships, right? Then these columns or these properties are going to be created. Means there is some that means what? That means while creating the database table, while we are creating the standard table, we are mentioning that there is a relationship between the student and standard table. Similarly, while creating the student address table, we are also creating some kind of a relationship, right? That means whatever foreign key we created in the database, those foreign keys are going to be represented as navigation properties inside the model classes. So these three property, right, is nothing but it is one entity. It is one entity. This is also a collection of entities, right? So that means what? Now for each student there is a standard entity. For each student there is a student address, and for each student there is a collection of a courses entity, or you can say related entity. So in this case, for this student is our main entity, or you can say student is the primary entity, and for this student entity, student address, standard, or these courses, right? These are nothing but your related entities, right? And now our intention is, right, while we are loading the this student entity, right? How you want to load the standard, student address, and the courses, right? Do you want to load all these related entities at the time of while loading the student entity? Or do you want to load these related entities on demand? That is what we are going to discuss, and that is what referred by lazy loading, eager loading, and explicit loading. Clear, guys? What are related entities,
Yes, sir.
right? So we will discuss these three approaches, right? So basically, explicit loading is nothing but it is another way of implementing the lazy loading. So we will discuss these three approaches, and then we will discuss what is the difference between eager loading and lazy loading, and which one to use in your real-time application. And we will discuss also the performance benchmark of using eager loading and lazy loading. Let us start the discussion with eager loading. Can anybody tell me what do you mean by eager loading, or what do you mean by lazy loading? Any idea? Anyone? Anybody having any idea?
No ideas.
Anyone else?
No.
Okay.
No.
Fine, fine. So basically, if you know eager loading and lazy loading, eager means load at the time of loading the main entity. Lazy loading means on demand or delay the loading of related entities, right? So let us start discussing this eager loading. Eager loading is the process where entity framework load the related entities along with the main entity, right? Load the related entities along with the main entity. What it means? It means if I'm loading the student entity, then while loading the student entity, please load the standard student address courses, right? Or while loading the student entity, I want to load the standard entity, I want to load the student address entity, right? At the same time, right? That means what? That means for loading the related entities, I do not want to make a separate database call, right? While so what it means, the eager loading means you are going to reduce the database call, right? So instead of a separate database call, I want to make a single SQL query which will join this main entity with the related entities and will return me the data. That means it with a single database call, I'm going to load all the related entities, right? And that is nothing but your eager loading. Eager loading, it is the process of loading the related entities, right, along with the main entity. That means in this case, entity framework will not execute separate SQL queries, right? Separate SQL queries for loading the related entity. All the entities are loaded from the database with a single query and hence saving bandwidth and server CPU time, right? Bandwidth means the number of time if you are doing the round trip with the database, the bandwidth is going to be increased, right? Again, the CPU time is going to be increased because more time it will use the CPU resources, right? And in this case, entity framework makes use of a join to load the related entities from the database, right? And guys, clear? What do you mean by eager loading? Eager loading means while loading the main entity, at the same time I'm going to load the related entities, right? And in this case, it will make use of a SQL join, right? Suppose I have written the query using eager loading, and I have written the query in such a way that it will load the student and the standard table data, right? That means it will not going to use any kind of you can say a more number of requests, right? Within a single request, it is going to load the student and the standard table data, right? This is nothing but eager loading. Eager loading means at the time of loading the main entity, please load the related entity data, what is required as per my business requirement, right? And how to implement this eager loading means now by default by default entity framework uses lazy loading while loading the related entity, right? So we'll discuss what is lazy loading. For now, forget about the lazy loading, right? If you want to use eager loading while loading the related entities, right, then you have to use the division include method. So what is exactly this include method means? Now to this include method, you need to pass the string related entity name, or you can say string path, right? Other overloaded version is there also. By using the lambda expression, you can also specify uh, you can specify the related entity name, what you want to what you want to load, right? Let me show you some example, right, so that you can understand these things very clearly, right? Right. So in this case, you can see I'm using context dot database dot log. So basically, this statement is I'm using to see what SQL statement is generated, right? Whether it is generating a single SQL statement to load the related entity, or it is using multiple SQL statement to load the related entity, right? What exactly is entity framework uses to load the related entity? That is what I'm going to print by using this console dot database dot log. And where I need to print the that SQL script, I want to print the SQL script on the console. That is why I'm specifying the console class and write method, right? So here you can see I'm using context object. I'm loading all the students, and while loading all the students, I'm also loading the standard entities, right? Standard data. So in this case, what will happen now when you run this application, right? So it will use SQL join between the student entity and the standard entity, and it will return the data using a single query. So this is nothing but your method syntax. If you are interested in query syntax, right? So as I mentioned, you have two options. So what is the other option is query syntax, right? So in this case you can see from the context dot students, right, I'm including the standard table, I'm loading the data into this, and then I'm fetching all the data, right? So this is nothing but your query syntax, right? So this is my primary table, and along with this primary table I'm including or I'm loading the standard table data, and whatever the data it is returning, that is storing in this variable, and from this variable I'm returning the data, right? If you want to represent in a different format, right, that also possible, right, which we will discuss in detail, right, once we start discussing the entity, once you start discussing the LINQ, right? So you have two options to use the include method. So basically you have to call the include method on the main entity to include these things, right? So in this case, what will happen, it will load the student data, and it will make a SQL inner left join with the standard table. And once it makes the join query, right, then whatever data is written, that is converted to list, and that is what we are storing in this variable. And then I'm printing the first name, last name, and then you can access the standard name. Directly you cannot access. To access the standard name, you have to use the standard reference navigation property and the description, right? So now run the application and see the output. So in this case, right, so you can say I'm getting the data as expected, that's fine, but here you need to understand the select code. So here you can see it is making use of a SQL join between the standard table and the student table, right? This is my student table. It is making in left join with my standard table based on the primary key column, right? So as it is using left outer join, right? So it is going to fetch the data from both the standard and the student table using a single SQL statement, right? Now, in this case, okay, to give you a little bit in what I'm saying, now I'm not using this include statement. If I remove this include statement, right, then by default it is going to use the lazy loading, right? So what is lazy loading? I'm going to discuss in detail. By default, entity framework uses lazy loading while loading the related entity. So what it means? It means while loading the main entity, right, it is not going to load. While loading the main entity, it is not going to load the related entity, right? In this case, I'm loading the main entity. At this particular point of time, it is not going to load the related entity. Then when it is going to load the related entity, now when you access the navigation property, at that time only it is going to access the related entity, and for each entity, right? That means what? Now it means how many number of students are there in the database, right? So currently if you go, it will having this number of, okay, let me delete where student ID is greater than 4, right? So let me delete this data, few data from the database. Okay, forget about this thing. Okay, so in this case, you can see these are the right data, right? That means what? Now for each student data, this is one student data, this is another, right? For each student data, while I'm accessing the standard property, right? It will make a SQL query and it will fetch the data. That means if my database table having 7 records, right? Then one SQL query to fetch all the 7 student entities, and plus 7 SQL query, right, to fetch the standard entity, right? Let me run this application and show you the output. objects. Okay, so sometimes the standard might be we have not added for few of the records. So what I can do is I can make use of this null collation operator, right? Null operator. So if the standard object is not null, then it will store the data, right? So you can see, okay, let's loading is disabled. Hmm. Right? So you can see this is my main query, right, which is based on the student table. Then how many queries are there, right, for retrieving the student whose ID is 2, student whose ID is 3, right, student whose ID is 4, student whose ID is 1. So these are the different SQL query, right, separate, or you can say separate SQL query which the SQL server or you can say which the entity framework generated in the case of a lazy load. So in the case of a lazy loading, it will not load the related entities while loading the main entity. But in the case of you can say eager loading, it is going to load the related entities while loading the main entity. Clear, guys?
Yes, so on line number 20, in the parameter for include method, you have passed like a standard keyword,
So
right? So
this
this,
this is nothing but the property, what the navigation property what you have inside the student entity, right? If you go to the student entity, this is the navigation property name, this is another navigation property name, this is another
yes,
navigation property name. So instead
yes.
of using the standard, right, so
Mhm.
you can also use the other overloaded version, right? Suppose I want to use a student, right? So you can also specify this property using the what I can say. First of all, you need to use the system dot data dot entity namespace, and using the lambda expression, you can also specify the property name. This is also fine. So this is nothing but your property name that is available inside the student entity.
Okay, so here the standard keyword should be matched with that property name, right?
Exactly. If the property name is not matched, then it will not it will not load.
Not
It
not for
will,
lambda expressor, for when you were passed
yeah, so you
as a
can pass
string.
this name as a string, that is fine, or you can pass this using the lambda expression, that is also fine. But
Yes, so
what
when you're
I
passing,
generally prefer to use this syntax, because in this case, if I'm providing a anything else, then it will give me compilation error, right? So if I'm passing standard two, it will give me compilation error. But if I'm using standard two, right, then it will not give me compilation error.
okay, so like here, what I'm saying is like when you are passing as a string, it's a case sensitive, right?
No, no, it's not case sensitive, right? So I'm making this here.
Okay, okay, that was my question.
No, no, sir. I think it will be case sensitive. Let me run this application. Right? So it's not case sensitive, but yeah, that's fine. You can see it's not case sensitive.
Okay, and one more question, like recently you have used that lambda expression, like how do you come to know like we can use lambda expression over here, like because
Right?
I wasn't aware, like but you used and I recognize like okay, I can use.
Right. So basically, if you go to this method, right? So what is this expecting? What is this?
uh,
Func.
Function, yeah,
If you go to the definition, what is this?
it's a delegate.
Delegate means you can specify. You have to specify something, na?
Hmm. Yes.
And that you can specify. So whenever you are using delegate, you can use lambda expression. No issue,
Oh, okay, okay,
right?
yeah, yeah, got it, thank you.
So this is
And
how.
can you include the change includes, like you have standard, you could have as well address?
So I'm going to show you everything, right? I'm going to use multiple label, multiple include many examples I'm going to show you. Don't worry. But this is the beginning, right? So how you can load one related entity, that is what I'm showing, right? I can include multiple properties, right? I can include all these three things, right? I can also include the standard, right? If you go to the definition of standard, right? There is a teachers collection that is multiple level. That is also possible. Every example I'm going to show you.
Okay.
Right? So this is how include is work. So include means it is going to generate one LINQ, one SQL join, right? So eager loading using lambda expression instead of string name, you can also specify the lambda expression, right? How to load multiple related entities using the include method? That is what your question, right? So if you see the student entity, right, then you can see there are having two properties, right? One is standard, another is student address of a reference type, another one is courses, right? Which is a collection type, right? So now my requirement is I want to load all these entities, right? I want to load all these entities, then how I can do this? Then what you need to do, you need to use multiple include method, right? Context dot student. I want to include the standard entity. I want to include the student address. If you are not interested with lambda expression, you can specify the string name. I want to include the courses entities, right? So then you have to use three include statements, right? And finally, you have to call the toList method. So all the related entities of of the student entity are going to be loaded and will be stored inside this variable, right? And then from this variable, you can the relationship between standard and student is what one to one. So by using that property directly, you can access the standard name, right? You can access the address, things like this, right? But these courses, it is a collection. Collection means you can use a for each loop and you can access the courses of each student separately, right? Now, if you run this application, then you will see that it is going to generate a SQL statement. In a single SQL statement, it is going to load all these entities data. And that single SQL statement will comprise of the student database table and making a left join, right, with student standard, student address, and the courses database tables, right? Let me run this application and show you the output. Yes. I'm getting the error again and again. Let me correct the data. Courses table, select tab from standard table, right? Okay, let me fix this in another way. How to fix? Right. So so guys, whenever you are working with a real-time application, right, please make sure to avoid this null reference exception, right? So because sometimes your application will crash if the foreign key relationship data are not available, right? So now you can see I'm getting the student name, right? I'm getting the standard name address, right? If the standard name is there, it will give you the standard name, else it will give you the address line, right? And in this case, you can see for this student taking these two courses, this student taking these two courses, the data we are getting as expected. Now the important is the select query. Is this making different SQLs in the query, or in a single select query, it is returning all the data? It is returning all the data using a single SQL query. That means the number of round trips between your .NET application and to the database is going to be reduced drastically, right? And you can see it is making use of joins, right? How many joins are there? This is my main entity student. It is making left outer join with student address. It is making left outer join with student, and it is making left outer join with this courses, right? So you can see this is the course system, right? So by using this SQL join, right, it is loading. It is loading the related entities using a single SQL query. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
So this is how you can use multiple the related. This is how you can load multiple related entities data using entity framework. Any question from anyone how to load multiple related entities? Yes. So you have other option also. You can go with the query syntax like this. This is the method syntax and this is the query syntax. Right. The next one is how to load multiple labels of related entities using the include method, right? So what do you mean by multiple labels of related entities? So multiple labels means if you go to the standard property, right? If you go to the standard, so what is my requirement? I want to load the student data. I want to include the standard data. But if you go to the standard property, there is a teachers collection. I also want to load this teachers data, right? So understand. So that means it is now not in a single level. Now it is loading the data from multiple level, right? So multiple level in the sense whatever property available inside this, right? This is nothing but from the same level. But but if you are trying to load some properties from another level, right? To standard, so standard, and if you go to the standard table, right? Or you can say if you go to the standard entity, there is something called the teachers, right? I also want to load the teachers. Then this is nothing but multiple labels. And how you are going to load multiple labels? By using the dot operator. Okay. So by using the dot operator, we can load multiple labels. So what it means? It means, right? So it means in this case, you can see I'm loading the student data, right? I'm loading the student data, but while loading the student data, I'm also including the standard data. Not only standard data, I'm also including the teacher's data. In this case, I cannot directly write like this, right? So in this case, if you are thinking, sir, in the previous example, you have used multiple include methods, right? Then why you cannot use like this, right? You cannot use like this. Why? Because this teacher's property, right? If you look at the syntax, right? Then this standard property belongs to this one, right? But do you have this teacher's property belongs to this student entity? Do you have any teacher's property inside the student entity?
No.
Then where this teacher's property is belongs to? Which
It
entity
belongs to
having it
standard.
belongs to standard. So can I write like this? Standard dot teachers? Yes,
Yes.
you can like this because in this case, your student entity having relation with the standard, or you can say the student entity having one property called standard, but this student entity doesn't have any property called teachers, so you cannot access teachers property directly. Yes, you can access, but how? Now, first of all, you need to include the standard, and from the standard, you can include the teacher's property. Clear? How to include multiple labels of related entities? Guys,
Yeah, and you will use the same thing if you wanted the courses, but not the student courses, but the teachers courses.
so any
Then you
anything, right?
use the multi-level, right?
Exactly. So if you want to go to courses, right? Then inside this courses entity, whatever navigation properties, right? That you can access.
Yeah.
Right? So first of all, you need to load the courses, and from the courses, then you need to go to the courses entity, and then you need to check what are the navigation property. Yes, this is having two navigation property. You can load the teacher, you can load the related student who belongs to that particular course, right? So basically what it means if those are available, directly inside the entity as a property, you can directly include them. But if they are available at different labels, right? Different labels, then you have to include them by using the dot operator. So once you access the dot operator, then intelligence will show you the student and teachers, right? So in this case, I'm loading these two things, right? And then you can go with the lambda expression. So this is the lambda expression, right? So you can go with the query syntax, right? And using the string name or using the lambda expressions, right? Both options are available here. I'm accessing the student data, right? From the student information, I'm printing the first name, last name. Let me go to the standard table. Standard table 1, 2, 3, 4. Student address table. Okay. Let me delete this one.
Enredado.
There are some unwanted data, right? Which is making, which is throwing some error. Right? So now our student table having only the required. Okay. Student table where student ID is greater than 4. Again, it is making the control. Okay, student course. Okay, let me check the student course database table. Okay, fine. Now it's fine. So now then what I'm trying to do, I'm just printing the student first name, last name, standard information, standard description, then I'm fetching the teacher's detail. But how you can access the teacher from the student entity, you have to go to the standard entity, and from the standard entity, you can go to the teacher's entity, right? And once you access the teacher's information, then you can print in the teacher ID and the teacher name, right? So in this case also, it is going to use a single join, right? It is not going to load the data using multiple SQL queries, right? So you can see it is having only a single SQL select statement, which is returning the data from the related entities at multiple levels. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
Right? So this is the use of eager loading. Later, I will show you. Later, I will show you what is the difference between lazy loading and eager loading, and when to go with eager loading, when to go with lazy loading, right? But in this case, if you see, I'm loading all the entities, right? In this case, I'm loading all the entities. It is not only for all the entities. If you are interested for a particular entity, that is also fine. Suppose I want to, right? Suppose I want to load the student whose ID is 1. Is there any student whose ID is 1? Yes. So I want to load the student whose ID is 1, not only student information. I want to include the student standard and a student address, right? So for that purpose, you can also, in this case, you can use this filter condition, faster default, and then you can access the data, right? So now run the application and you should see it is going to load only the single database to single student data, right? And in this case also it is going to use that single select statement using left outer join, and here it is making use of the where conditional clause, because you have to face this one. So whenever you are using this filter condition, means it is going to use the where conditional clause. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
this is how you need to work with the eager loading, right? So next we are going to move further, right? Let's move further and let's try to understand the lazy loading concept, right? So by default, entity framework uses the lazy loading concept. Lazy loading means what? Now, on-demand loading. On-demand loading means what? Now, by default, the related entities are not going to be loaded whenever you want or whenever you accessing those related entities. At that time, only those entities are going to be loaded, right? And to implement lazy loading, we do not need to do anything special, because by default, entity framework uses the lazy loading concept, right? So for lazy loading, you do not need to do anything special, right? So in this case, right, what I'm showing you, right? So in this example, okay, not this one, right? So in this case, what you can say, I'm using the database log. I'm accessing one student information whose ID is 1. So at this time, right, at this time, only the student entity data is going to be written from the database, right? So in this case, it will create a select SQL statement, which is going to return the student entity, right, whose student ID is 1 from the database by using a single SQL statement, right? So later, here I'm accessing the SQL student address, right? So when I'm accessing the student address, then what entity framework will do is it will execute, it will generate another SQL statement, and that SQL statement is going to be executed in the database to return the student address data. And whenever I'm accessing the standard property, right, of the student entity, then in this case, another SQL statement is going to be generated, and that SQL statement is going to be executed on the database to fetch the corresponding standard table data. And in this case, when I'm accessing the courses property, right, so again, another SQL statement is going to be generated, and that SQL statement is going to be executed in the database, and that SQL statement is going to return me the courses information of that particular student. That means in this case, how many SQL statement? One SQL statement to load the student, another SQL statement to load the standard, another SQL statement to load the student address, and another SQL statement to load the courses information, right? So now let me run the application and show you the output. So in this case, by default, lazy loading is enabled. You do not need to do anything special, right? So you can see this is one SQL statement to load the student table data. You can see this is the student table data. Another SQL statement to load the student address data. Another SQL statement to load the standard table data. Another SQL statement to load the courses table data. That means lazy loading means whenever you require, whenever you demand, whenever you are accessing the navigation property, at that time only it is going to generate and execute SQL statement on the database and return the data. But what in the case of eager loading? In the case of eager loading, while we are loading the main entity, at that time only the related entities are going to be loaded from the database, and for that purpose entity framework, or you can say DB context class, generate some SQL statement by joining the related table. But in this case, no joining is there, only single SQL statement is there. Clear, guys? Guys,
Yes.
so this is how lazy loading is implemented in your .NET application, right? So now the question is, can we disable lazy loading in entity framework? Yes, lazy loading can be disabled, right, in entity framework, right? How we can disable the lazy loading? Okay, to turn off lazy loading, right? So lazy loading can be turned off for all the entities, or it is also possible to turn off for a particular entity, right? So if you look at our example, right, our model classes having many entities, right? Courses, standard, student address, teacher, right? These are different entities. If you want to turn off lazy loading for all the entities, right, or to some particular entities, both options are available, right? Let us try to understand this. To turn off lazy loading for a particular entity, do not make it virtual, right? So what you need to do, right? If you go to the entity, right? If you go to the entity, so now my requirement is that, so this is my student entity. Inside the student entity, I'm having the standard property. I'm having the student address property, right? So if you go to the student entity, then you will see that these two are nothing but your reference type entity, and this is also a collection type entity, right? So that means these are nothing but your related entity. So if you do not want to load, right? If you do not want this entity to be loaded lazily, so what you need to do, simply remove this virtual keyword. You do not want student address to be loaded lazily, remove this virtual keyword, right?
Yeah, it's not like a, I don't know, like a typical kind of bit. What's cool is kind of like, is like, oh,
Hello, anyone saying anything?
no, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I didn't know I was unmuted. Sorry.
Right? So basically what you need to do, if you want to make sure that particular entity should not be lazily loaded, then simply you need to remove the virtual key, right? You know what is virtual keyword, and simply this keyword used in this case is not required because we are not overriding anything. Simply remove this virtual keyword, simply remove this virtual keyword. Once you remove the virtual keyword, now the student entity for this standard entity, lazy loading is disabled for student, right? For student entity, now you cannot lazily load standard, you cannot lazily load student address, right? But you can lazily load courses because still you are having this virtual property in the signature, right? So this is how you can lazily load, how you can disable, or how you can turn off the lazy loading in your .NET application, right? Now, what I'm trying to say you, so in this case, you will see that as the lazy load is disabled, right? So now no more SQL query to the database, right? So in this case, you can see while I'm fetching the student data, it is only going to load the student information, right? That is fine. That we already know. But in this case, while accessing the student address property, first of all, it will check whether lazy loading for this particular property of student entity is enabled or not. Now it will check, yes, student, which property we are accessing, your student address. Each student address for this student address, lazy loading is enabled or disabled. It is turned on because virtual keyword is not there, means lazy loading is disabled. So in this case, it will not make any SQL statement, right? It will not going to call the database by creating a separate SQL statement, right? As it is not generating anything, right? By default, the default value of this data type is going to be stored. What is the default value of student address? Can anybody tell me? Which kind of type is
Null.
No, the default is no for the reference.
So in this case, null will be stored. So here I'm checking if student address equals to null, then it is going to student address is not loaded. And this makes sense. Why? Because we have turn off the lazy loading, right? Turn off the lazy loading means no more SQL statement is going to be generated. That is fine, right? Now, again, the same thing will check here whether the for this standard entity, right? For this standard related entity, lazy loading is enabled or disabled. Lazy loading is disabled. So it is not going to generate and execute any SQL statement over the database. So again, it is going to store the null value. And for this particular entity, right, courses, lazy loading is enabled or disabled. it will go and check, yes, for this courses property, lazy loading is enabled. So in this case, it will make, it will generate SQL statement and it will execute the SQL statement on the database and it will return the data, and that data you can see. Yeah, right. So in this case, two statement will be generated, two SQL statement will be generated, one for loading the student entity, another for loading the courses information. But for loading the student address and standard, there is no more SQL statement, right? So you can see this is the SQL statement to load the student data. You can see student data, right? You can see standard address is not loaded, student address is not loaded, standard is not loaded. That means this statement is printed. That means this statement is printed. This statement is printed means these two variables holding the null. Why it is holding the null? Because no more SQL statement is generated. You can see after the select statement, is there any select statement? No, there is no more select statement. That means the lazy loading is working fine, right? And then again, it is using these courses, and for courses related entity, lazy loading is enabled, and hence you can see it is generating one more select statement to get or to fetch the courses information from the database, and that data it is printing. Yeah. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So in this case, you can turn off the lazy loading, right? But you can also, if you are interested to include the, what I can say, if you are interested to use, if you are turning off, right? Can you use the include method here? Yes, you can use include method. No issue. Include is something different than lazy loading now. So in this case, what you need to do, you need to provide the student address, right? So you need to provide the student address. So in this statement, what exactly it is going to do? It is going to generate the, it is going to make the SQL syntax, right? By joining with the student address, right? Now you can see, now you can remove these strings, right? And now you can check this one. Not only student, you have to check this one. Right? Student dot what is the property name? Student address, right? If this is not equals to null, then you have to check this one, right? And here you can access this one, address 1, and here address 2, right? So in this case, you will see it is going to generate the SQL query by joining the student table with student address table, because even though lazy loading is disabled, you can use eager loading, no issue, right? Now you can see it is making a inner join with the student address table, and here you can see address line 1 and address line 2 data. Clear, guys?
Yes, actually, I'm having one question.
Yes.
So in the class, we have manually removed the virtual keyword, right? So let's
Right.
say I was updating one of the classes and I was updating from the database right now. So what will happen? Again, it will put the virtual keyword to the class or not?
Yes, it will put the virtual keyword to the class.
So again, we have to remove manually, right?
Right? No, not manually. So what I can say you is, you can disable the lazy loading for a particular entity in a different manner, right? So here, while writing the coding, you can also disable the lazy loading, right?
Okay.
So that we will see. So, but for now, you understand this thing,
Yes.
right? Now, how to disable lazy loading, right? Let's see, for all entities, right? In now, as of now, we have discussed lazy loading for a particular entity, right? Now we will see how to disable lazy loading for all entities. So I'm making this as virtual, I'm making this as virtual, right? So once you make this as virtual, then what you need to do, you have to go to the context class. So first of all, I have enabled lazy loading at the class level, right? Now go to the database, where you need to go. You need to the context class, right? Context class, here you need to write this dot configuration dot lazy loading enabled equals to false, right? So even though if you want, right, you can also write the same thing here. Context dot configuration dot lazy loading equals to false, right? If you write lazy loading equals to false, right, then for this context object, right, for this student address and whatever you are writing, for those entities, it is going to make this lazy loading false, right? So, so in that case, you do not need to use the virtual key. You do not need to remove the virtual keyword from here, right? Okay, let me show you these things, right? Let me first comment this one, right? Even though lazy loading is enabled at the class level, we have disabled here, right? Now, let me remove these things. Okay, let me put the previous example code. Context dot configuration dot lazy loading enabled. So what is configuration class? We have already discussed. Any configuration that you want to set for this entity, you have to use configuration. And for this, using this configuration, right now I'm making lazy loading enabled equals to false. Means what? Now this context will not use lazy loading anymore, right? Now, even though you are accessing these things, right? You are accessing the standard, you are accessing the courses, and if you go to the standard student and the courses table, then you will see that virtual is enabled, right? So now no more lazy loading. So you will say the same output as what we have seen in our previous example. But even though in this case, courses is also not going to be loaded. Clear? Understand?
Yes.
Yes,
Right?
sir.
Now you might have one question, sir. If I'm disabling lazy loading, but I want to load the courses entity, how is that possible? For that purpose, you need to go with the explicit loading, what is we are going to discuss after some time. Clear? Now, in this case, you can see student standard courses, no data is loaded, but later I want to include the student data. Is that possible? Even though lazy loading is disabled, it is still possible to load the courses entity. And that is possible by using the concept of explicit loading. That is what we are going to discuss next. Clear, guys? Right? So you can disable the lazy loading, and for this particular context object, lazy loading is disabled, right? But if and if you are creating, right? So let me create another using statement, right? I'm creating another context object, and in this context object, I'm making this as false. As I'm making this as false, then you will see that, okay, let me give a console.write line. Let me put some statement so that you can easily identify, right? Now, for this context object, the lazy loading is disabled. But for this context object, is the lazy loading is disabled? Guys? So this
No.
is a different context object. This is a different context object, right? For this context object, we have made the lazy loading false. But this for this context object, the lazy loading is not false, right? So in this case, if you run the application, right, then you will see that for the first context object, right, student address, why it is not executing? Okay, we have put this console.read statement here. Let me remove this one and let me put that statement here, right? So now run the application. Right? So you can see for this one, the lazy loading is disabled. For other, the lazy loading is still enabled. Clear?
Yes.
Why this is happening? Because in this case, for this context object, right, what we are creating, right, for this context object, lazy loading is disabled. And this context object and this context object, both are not same. This is a different instance of this class. This is another instance of this class, and both instances are a different one, right? This is the oops concept, right? Now my requirement is I want to disable lazy loading for all the context object, right? Then for that purpose, what you need to do is you have to go to the context class, and to this constructor, you need to specify that lazy loading, and this means what? Current class configuration property, please make this lazy loading to false, right? And once you make this as false, right, now no matter how many number of a context object you created, right, all the context object are going to be disabled. Lazy loading disabled. You can see this is my context object one output and this is my context object two output. Clear?
Yes.
Right? So guys, this is the reason why I'm saying again and again, please attend the classes, right? Because these things are not available in the documentation, because these things we need to go and check many examples, different kind of example, doing some addition, removal, right? Those things are not going to possible put everything in the documentation, right? But documentation, whatever I'm providing, that is enough. But these additional things you will learn, you will only learn when you are attending the classes, right? So this is the reason why I'm saying again and again, don't miss the classes, right? So many additional external extra examples we are going to learn in the classes. Clear, guys? What is the lazy loading and what is eager loading?
Yeah.
Right. Now the next important question, which is mostly asked in the interview, what is the difference between lazy loading and eager loading, and when to use eager loading over lazy loading and the vice versa, right? So first of all, is the only one and only difference is loading the related entities. Apart from loading the related entities, do you find any other differences? When the entities are going to be generated, right? Whether the entities are generated at the time of loading the main entities or whether the entities are generated on demand. This is the only difference or anything else?
Well, the round trips, right?
Sorry?
The round trips to the server.
Yeah. So that's basically, see, the round trips to the database server, it is an internal thing, right? Internal thing. See, if it is loading the related entities on demand, means it is separate, making different SQL statement, right? If it is loading all these entities in a single at the time of loading the main entity, means what? Now it is using the SQL join, right? Yes, obviously this is one of the I mean, this is the alternative meaning of this thing, right? If you are loading the related entities, means using a single SQL query, you are loading the related entity, or using multiple SQL query, you are loading the related entity, right? So this is the only difference, right? So you can go with eager loading when you are sure that you will be using the related entities with the main entity everywhere, right? So what it means? Now it means you need to choose eager loading. When you need to choose eager loading, now you need to choose eager loading if I am loading the related entities and if I am using that related entity frequently and everywhere, then only I need to go with eager loading. For this, for example, I'm having the student entity and along with the student data like the first name, last name, ID, all these things, I'm going to use the student address everywhere along with the student entity. Trying to understand my point. And while I'm printing the first name, last name, I also need to print the student address. But I'm not interested, but I'm not using the standard everywhere, right? That means what? That means while loading the student entity, you have to load the student address, because the student address you are going to use everywhere. But if you are not using that property, right, everywhere, then don't load that property, right? Don't load that related entity while loading the main entity. And this is where you need to go with lazy loading. That means it completely depends whether you want to use the related entities or not. If you are using the related entities, then go with the include method. If you are not using the related entity at some different point of time and here and there you are just using that property, right? Then don't go with the include method, or you should go with the what I can say lazy loading, right? So for example, this is my student entity, right? This is my student entity, right? I'm using the student entity at multiple places, at places 1, at places 2, at places 4, right? 4 places, right? And this student entity along with I'm having student address, right? And courses, let assume, right? At many student address and courses. So what my requirement is, I'm using student and student address here, right? I'm using in place 1, I'm using this one in place 2, I'm using this one in place 3, I'm using this one in place 4, I'm using this one, doing some other tasks. And some other places, right? Some other places, I'm going to use student and a student course, student and courses. That means in this case, which entity are going to be used frequently? So this is the main entity. Forget about the student entity. Among the student address and courses, which entity, which related entity you are using frequently? Guys, tell me.
Student and student address.
Student address. That means now while loading the student entity, you should include the student address. You should not include the courses because you are not using that immediately or you are not using that everywhere. If you are using that entity immediately and everywhere, then you should go with what concept? Eager loading or lazy loading?
Eager loading.
Eager loading, right? And if you are not using that entity immediately, and if you are not using that entity everywhere, then you need to go with what concept?
Lazy loading.
Lazy loading. So you understand when to use eager loading and when to use lazy loading,
Yeah.
Yes,
right?
yes, yes.
So when to use eager loading and lazy loading means it completely depend on the business requirement of your application. So if you are not interested for related entities or the related entities are not used instantly, then you can use lazy loading to improve the application performance. In this case, if you go with eager loading, then it will load the related entities instantly, even though they are not and are not required instantly. The reason is eager loading will generate and execute SQL join, whereas lazy loading simply use the select statement, right? So if the related entity is not required, and if you are going with the eager loading, then what it will make? It will make a SQL join, right? And if you go with the lazy loading, what it will do? It will generate a simple SQL statement. Now you just tell me, SQL join is going to take more time, or a simple SQL statement will take more time? Which will take more time?
Join.
Join. So definitely, if the related entity is not required, and if I am going with the eager loading, it will use SQL join, which is going to take more time. That means my application performance is going to be improved, or my application performance is going to be decreased. Guys,
Decreased.
Improved.
decreased only, right? On the other hand, if you are interested for related entities or the related entities are used instantly in your application, then you need to go with eager loading to get better performance. In this case, if you go with lazy loading, then it will not load the related entities instantly. It will load the related entities by using separate SQL query. That means let's imagine your main entity having 100 records. Then for each 100 records, that means 100 SQL statements separately is going to be generated by the entity framework, and those 100 separate SQL statements are going to be executed with the database. That means how many number of times there is a interaction between your .NET application to the database, right? 100 round trips, right? As the more number of round trips means what? Your application performance is going to be decreased or not? In this case, you need to go with eager loading. With eager loading, with a single round trip, right, you will get the required data, right? So then also that means as the more number of round trips are decreased, so the better the performance. Clear, guys? Clear or not?
Yeah. Yes.
So simply, if someone asks you whether which one will give you better performance, right? So you cannot simply say eager loading will give you better performance, lazy loading will give you better performance. So you have to say it depends on the business requirement. What exactly we want to achieve, right? So we cannot simply say eager loading is better or lazy loading is better. It's depend on the requirement, whether the related entities are required and are used immediately and frequently or not. If the related entities are required and used, then you will need to go with lazy loading. If the related entities are not required, then we need to go with a lazy loading. So let us understand this with an example, right? So in this case, what is my requirement? Now I want to fetch the student data, right? And I want to fetch the courses information, right? So for that purpose here, I'm loading the particular student data. Yeah. So the first example, what I'm showing the lazy loading. So here my requirement is I want to load all the student and their courses information. So for this purpose, let us start the see and how much time how much time it is going to take. So I'm starting the stopwatch, right? I'm creating an instance of stopwatch. I'm starting the stopwatch. First, I'm loading the student entities. In this case, the courses or student address or the standard, no related entities are going to be loaded, right? So before that, what I need to do is I need to do one thing. First of all, I need to make this as what I can say, make this as lazy loading enable, right? So, in this case, only student entities are going to be loaded. Then using for each loop, I'm printing the student first name and the last name, right? Then by using the for each loop, I'm accessing the courses information. That means the number of a student, if 10 or if 100, that means this for each loop, right? For each student, this for each loop is going to be executed, right? And that means for the number of time this for each loop will execute means that will depend upon the outer for each loop, and that many number of time it will generate the SQL queries, right? So if the number of student is 10, then it will make 10 database call to the database to fetch the courses information, right? And once the task is completed, we are stopping the thing and we are just printing how many milliseconds it is taking to call to do the task, right? Let me run this application. Right. So how many milliseconds it took, guys?
802.
802. And guys, if you are getting right, okay, let me run the other application. So with the eager loading, let me do the same thing and print the time, how much time. With the lazy loading, it is taking 802 seconds, right? So with lazy loading, it is taking 802 milliseconds. Now what I'm trying to do, I'm just using the eager loading. I'm including the courses information directly here, and then I'm printing the same thing, right? So now with eager loading, let me run the application and print you the time, how much time it is taking. How much time it is taking?
618 milliseconds.
618, which is giving you better performance. And guys, remember, in this case, only 4 records are there. If the number of record is 1000, 100, then imagine how much time it is going to take by lazy load. Right? In this case, we are not getting that very big time differences because our database table is only having 4 records. That means 4 additional SQL statements are generated with lazy loading. But imagine if your database, right, if your student table having 1000 records, then what is the impact it on the application performance? Clear, guys?
Yes.
So this is the scenario where you need to go with a eager loading. Now let me give you another example, right? So another example. So in this example, I'm not interested with the child entities, right? I'm not interested with the child entities. In this case, you can see I'm only interested with the student entity. So in this case, you can see I'm using the students and to list. I'm only interested with the student entities. I'm printing the student name and address. So in this case, with lazy loading, one select statement will issue without any kind of join, and that is going to return me the data, and it is returning me the data in 500. milliseconds, right? So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to do the same example using eager load, right? So I'm going to do the same example using the eager loading. So in the case of eager loading, what you need to do, you need to include the related entities. I'm including the student entity, right? I'm including the standard entity, right? So in this case, I'm including the standard and the courses entities, even though they are not used in my application, right? So now run the application. So how much time it is taking? So previously it is taking 500 milliseconds. Now it is taking something 600 milliseconds, right? So the point that you need to remember, you cannot simply you cannot simply specify that eager loading is giving you better performance or lazy loading giving you better performance. It is completely depend on your business requirement, whether you need to use eager loading or whether you need to use lazy loading. Is that clear?
Yes.
Right? So without looking at the application requirement and what we are trying to achieve, we cannot simply say one approach is better over the other approach. Both lazy loading and eager loading having their own advantages and disadvantages, and we have seen there are clear performance differences between these two approaches to achieve the same task. With eager loading in entity framework, all the data, main entity data as well as its related entity data, is retrieved using a single query which involves SQL join, which can cache in memory to improve the application performance, right? So with eager loading, we are reducing the number of round trips with the database. With lazy loading in entity framework, we only retrieve just the amount of data we need in the single query. When we need the related data, then additional queries are issued to the database. This means there are several round trips between the .NET application and the database server. In general, each database round trips can degrade the application performance. So lesser the round trip, the better the performance. So the conclusion is that based on your application requirement, you need to choose whether you need to use lazy loading or eager loading in entity framework. Clear?
Yes.
Okay. The next concept what we are going to discuss, right? It is explicit load, right? What is explicit loading? So explicit loading means now once you disable the lazy loading, right? Once you disable, okay, let me right. So let me disable the lazy loading. So in this case, lazy loading is disabled. Once the lazy loading is disabled, then can you access the courses information in this using lazy loading, guys?
No.
Right. So in this case, can I access the student address?
No.
No. So why we cannot access these things? Because lazy loading is disabled, so it is no more generate SQL query to paste the data from the database, right? So in this case, you can see only one select statement and first name, last name, address is null and no course information is there, right? Now what is my requirement? I want to disable lazy loading in my application, but at some point of time, we need to load some related entities, right? And if that is the case, then you need to go with the explicit loading. And how you are going to do explicit loading, let us see, right? So this is my main entity. I have placed the data of this particular student, and that entity information is stored inside this variable, right? Student here is nothing but it's a reference variable, right? Then now what is my requirement? I want to load the student address data explicitly. Then if you want to load the student address data explicitly, then you have to use this syntax, right? So what is the syntax? Now, first of all, you have to use the context.entry method. To this entry method, you need to pass the student object, right? And this object means this is the main object where we need to load the related entities, right? And after the student object, right, then you need to check you want to load one related entity, right? Which kind of a related entity is this one? This one is a reference, this one is a reference, and this is a collection navigation property. This is reference navigation, this is reference navigation, and this is a collection navigation property. Right. So based on the type, you need to choose whether collection or reference. This student address, it is a collection or reference navigation property. Guys,
Reference.
reference. And in this case, I want to load the courses. Courses is a collection, a navigation property or reference?
Collection.
Collection. So as student address is a reference navigation property, I'm invoking the reference method. As courses is a collection navigation property, I'm referring it using the collection method, right? And when I call this load method, what internally it will do, the context object, the context object will retrieve the related student address of this particular student entity and will store inside this particular variable. And in this case, what will happen when we call the load method? Now the entity framework will retrieve the related courses information of this particular student entity object and will store those courses information inside this courses variable. Clear? Or any question from this two? Guys, why
No.
I'm using reference property here? Guys, tell
To
me.
load the reference
Because this student
classes.
address is a reference type variable, right? Why I'm using collection means this courses is nothing but just a property of the student object, and the type of this courses is a I collection, right? And why I'm using a student object here? Because I want to load this information inside the student entity only. I want to load the courses information inside the student entity only. And when I call this load method, right, at that time only, it is going to paste the data from the database and store inside this variable. Clear?
Yes.
Right. So now if you run the application, right, even though the lazy loading is disabled, explicitly we are loading the related entity. This is nothing but explicit loading. Right. So you can see this is my select statement. And for explicit loading, it is using this syntax. For explicit loading the courses, it is using the syntax. Now you can see it is printing the address and the course info. Clear? Guys?
Yes.
So these are the different options, right? So these are the different options that what you can use in entity framework to load the related entities. You can go with eager loading, you can go with lazy loading, and you can go with the explicit loading. Any question from anyone?
No.
Okay. The next important topic, right? What we are going to discuss is disconnected entities, right? So disconnected entities. What do you mean by disconnected entity, right? Disconnected entity. Okay, let me do one thing, right? So student equals to 1, right? and I'm using student object here. Right. So in this case, okay, see what I'm trying. This is one context object. Let's context object one, context object two, and here I'm using context object two, and here I'm using context object two. Right. What is the ID of one data? Stephen Smith 2, right? So in this case, what I'm trying to do, I'm just running the application. Right? So in this case, if you go and check the database, the data is not updated. So in this case, I'm updating the first name. I'm calling the step changes method, right? I'm fetching the student ID 1, but the name is not updated. Why? That we need to understand, right? So in this case, this is my student entity, right? This is my context object. This context object, right, track the student data, right? Because why it is tracking? Because this context object retrieving the data from the database, and hence it is tracking the state of the entity, right? So in this case, right, in this case, if I'm going and I'm doing the changes here, right, okay, right, if I'm some name 2, if I'm doing here some name 2, right, then it is going to, and if I'm calling the step changes method, right, how to increase the brightness, right? So in this case, does anyone know how to increase the brightness of the machine?
Do you have a laptop?
Yes.
So there should be like there is a brightness button along with your that F1, F2, F3 button. There should be some kind of symbol, light symbol.
Just type in brightness in the command bar at the bottom.
Yeah, that will also good.
Okay. I think there is something in my computer properties.
No. You see in the left bottom corner beside your Windows symbol, type here to search.
No, that is fine. Run window you mean to say?
Yes.
No,
No,
just type in, no. Directly type here to search, just type in brightness.
Bright, if you type.
Okay.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
first. Yeah, here you can.
Okay. So basically why this is happening right now, if I run this application, right, you will see the first name is going to be updated to some name 2. Right, let me run the application, right? So now you can see the database, if you go to the database table, right, okay, let me remove all these things, these are not required. So this is, now you can see first name is updated, but the same thing here, I'm updating the name some name, but this is not reflecting. Why? To understand this thing, we need to understand one concept, right? So why this is happening and why this is not happening in this case. So in this case, this context object, right, fetching the data from the database and storing inside this variable. That means what? Now, whatever object we are storing inside this variable, this context object one tracking this. Context object know the state of this entity. He know currently the state is unchanged, and when he is updating the data, he know the state is modified, and when he call this method, right, then that modified means it is generating one update script and executing it on the database. You can say this is the way, right? But this is not happening in this case. Why? Because in this case, so I'm using the student object here, but do you think this context object know the state of this student entity? Is this context object to retrieving the data from the database and storing the data inside this variable? No, he's not retrieving the data from the database. So by default, this context object 2 does not aware about the state of this entity. Even though we are modifying, still he doesn't know what is the state of this entity, whether the state is modified or unchanged or detached, right, or deleted. What is the state? I don't know. Why? Because for context object 2, this is a disconnected entity, and for context object 1, this is the connected entity, right? Connected entity means the context object know exactly the state of the entity, the context object tracking the state of the entity, and this is possible when we are retrieving the data and storing inside this variable using the context object. But in this case, we are not creating this student object, right? We are not fetching the data in this case. Context object 2, it is not fetching the data, right? It is not tracking the state of this entity, and this is the reason why whenever you call the save changes method, nothing is happening, because for this context object, student is a disconnected entity. Disconnected entity means context object not tracking the state of that particular entity. In this case, context object tracking the state of the entity, and hence whenever we are updating the data, it is updating the data in the database. Clear?
Yes.
Right? So what do we mean by disconnected and connected? That is what we are going to discuss, right? So the entity framework DB context instance automatically track the entities which are written from the database. Any changes that we made to these entities are also tracked by the context object. And when we call the save changes method on the context object, the changes are updated to the database. That is what we have already discussed so far in this course, right? So that is we have already discussed. So this is nothing but your connected environment, right? So and what is means this is. So this context object tracking the entity whenever we are modifying the data, it is also tracking the state of the entity, and whenever you are calling the save changes method, it is going to make the changes updated into the database. In some scenarios, it is also possible that entities are retrieved from the database using one context object and then going to be updated into the database and saved into the database using a different context object. In this type of scenario, right, the second context object, in order to update the entity in the database, needs to know the entity state of the application and whether the entities are new or existing, right? So what exactly it means, right? So let me do one thing. Okay, let me move these things to a different method. Get student, right? And this is going to be my save student method. Right? So my responsibility of a get student method not to do these things. He only needs to retrieve the data, right? And here I'm going to update the data. I'm doing some modification with this data, right? Now, so my requirement is that one of the context object is returning me the data, and another context object, right, it is going to save the data. So in this case, get student method returning me the student data, and the save student method, right, it is going to save the student data. That means it is using a context object to retrieve the data. It is using another context object to save the data, right? So once the get student retrieve me the data, I have modified the data, right? And then I'm passing the student data to this receive student method. Now, does this context object know what is the state of this entity? Guys, whether the entity state is modified, unchanged, deleted, how he able to know? Is this context object tracking the student entity? Guys, tell me.
No.
No. So if he is not tracking the student entity, so if I'm going to call this step changes method, does he going to create any kind of update statement?
No.
Yes, it is not going to create any kind of update statement, right? It is not going to create insert, update, delete. Nothing is going to be happening because this context object not tracking this one because this is a disconnected entity, right? Disconnected entity means context object will not track that entity. This is the meaning of this one. The point that you need to remember is that entities which are not tracked by the context object are known as disconnected entities. So what is disconnected entities? Now the entities which are not tracked by the context object. Now in this case, this is my context object and this context object not tracking this entity. That means this is a disconnected entity for this context object. Clear?
Yes.
Right. Now we need to understand how to work with the disconnected entity and how we can make sure that whenever we are calling the step changes method based on the state, it is going to do the changes into the database, right? So saving an entity in disconnected environment is different than connected environment. So in this case, you can see if I'm calling the step changes method here, nothing is going to happen. If I call the step changes method here, it is going to generate the SQL statement based on the current entity state because this context object is tracking this context because this is a connected entity for context one, and here student is a disconnected entity for context object two, right? So how we are going to this it? So saving an entity in disconnected environment is different than the connected environment, right? There are two things or two steps that you need to be taken care when you are working with a disconnected entity graph, right? So here we need to understand one term, what is entity graph, right? So can anybody tell me what do you mean by entity graph? In any idea having anyone?
No.
Right. So okay, let me tell you. See, if I'm creating one student object, right? So it means what? Not only the student object, but also it is having some reference properties or not. These are nothing but your child entities or not, right? So entity graph means it is not only the main entity, but including the child entities, right? You want to update only the entity or you want to update the child entities as well. If you are updating only the main entity, this is nothing but just entity. If you want to update the child entities as well, when you are updating the main entity, this is nothing but your entity graph. Clear? Right? So
Yes.
right, so if the main entity updating the child entities as well, right, while you are updating the student entity, you also want to update the standard and student address, then this is nothing but your entity graph, right? So this is the meaning of entity graph, means main entity with its related entity. First, we need to attach the disconnected entity with the new context object, right? Why it is required? Because once we attach the disconnected entity with the context object, then only the what I can say, then only the context object going to track the entity state. Yes or no? Until and unless we are not attaching the disconnected entity with the context object, right? The context object is not going to track, right? So we need to attach the disconnected entity with the context object. Second, while we are attaching the disconnected entity with the context object, we need to set the appropriate states, right? So we need to set the appropriate entity state for each disconnected entity manually, right? So this is going to be done manually. Why? Because automatically he cannot decide what is the entity state. As a developer, we need to write the logic in such a way that it should decide the entity state, right? So automatically not possible. Manually, we need to write some kind of logic so that it will take the appropriate entity state. For example, we need to understand, suppose you are having some disconnected entity graph or a single entity. All right, so you are having student address and courses entities, right? Then what you need to do, first of all, you need to attach this entity graph to the DB context, right? So while you are attaching the entity into the DB context, you need to set the appropriate entity state, whether the entity state is modified, added, unchanged, deleted, what is the state that you need to set. So first you should have the entity graph, then you need to attach the entity graph into the DB state. Once you attach, then you need to set the entity state manually. Clear, guys? How we are going to attach and how we are going to set the entity state, we will see practically. But for now, you have to understand, if you are having one disconnected entity, means you have to attach that disconnected entity into the DB set, as well as you need to set the entity state manually. Clear?
Okay.
Yes.
Right? So we have already discussed these things, right? So we have already discussed dbcontext.entry method. We have already discussed dbcontext.add method. We have already discussed dbset.attachment, right? Add method means what? Right? It will add the entity with the state as added. And what is dbset? Dbset.attachment, it will attach the entity with unchanged entity state. And what is dbset.entry, right? So in this case, right, you have to specify the entity state, right? Let's see, we are having three different ways where we can attach and disconnected entity graph with the DB context object, and we can set the entity states. Let us start with the DB context.entity entry method. Right, so the syntax is this one, right? So what you need to do, context.entry, this is nothing but your entity, and you have to set the entity state as a modified or deleted or added, right? The entry method of a DB context class attaches the entire entity graph. So in this case, it is saying entire entity graph. So what do you mean by this entire entity graph, right? So what do you mean by this entire entity graph? See, suppose I'm attaching the student entity, and if the student entity having the student address, having the standard, having the, what I can say, courses, right? Then the entity state is also not only going to set for the student entity, but also it is going to set the entity state for the corresponding student address, standard, and the courses entities, right? So this is the things that you need to understand how it is going to set. Let us see these things practically, right? So first of all, I will show you the step one, that is I'm attaching the entity state. I'm attaching the context object, and I'm attaching the I'm setting the entity state. Later, I will show you how to call the step changes method, right? So in this case, you can see I'm creating the entity graph. So in this entity graph, see this entity, I'm not fetching from any database, right? No one is tracking this entity. So in this case, you can see I'm creating the first name, last name, and standard. And here you can see student ID is empty, right? So I have not included the student ID column here. That means what? Now it is a new student. It is not an existing student. If student ID is exist, means it is a existing student. If student ID not exist, means it is a new student. So then I'm attaching the standard information, right? With the student entity, I'm providing the standard information. You can see standard ID 1, right? 1 and 1 description. This is nothing but your standard ID information. I'm also attaching the student address. I'm also attaching the courses. Courses means it's a collection property. So I'm creating a new list of courses. I'm adding one course. In this case, the key is empty, and I'm adding another course. In this case, I'm adding this course with the key value, right? Course name, if you want, You can also provide. That means what? It means, right, this is another entity, right? So in this case, intentionally I'm making this empty, and in here I'm providing the view. Why I'm providing this thing later I will explain, right? So if you remember, if you see some of the key column, key means what? The primary key column value I'm making for the student object, right, is empty. Here I'm providing the standard ID, means I'm providing the primary key column. Here I'm not providing the primary key column. Here I'm not providing the primary key column, and here I'm providing the primary key column. Why I'm not providing for some of the entity? Why I'm providing some of the entity? That we will discuss while that will come into the picture, right? While we are saving the entity, right? So now we have created our entity graph. Can is this an entity graph or entity? Guys,
A graph.
graph. Why? Because it is not only include its own information, but it is having the child properties, right?
Mhm.
Right. Now I'm using the context object. While I'm using the context object, I'm setting the entity state as added. So context dot entry student. So now the context object is going to track the student entity, and I'm setting the state as added, right? So checking the entity state of each entity. So right now in this entity, this is our main entity student, but apart from this main entity, we are having one entity for standard, one entity for student address, and two entity for to hold the course information, right? So in this case, if you want to check what is the state of each entity, then you can use the change tracker.entries method. So this change tracker.entries method will give you the track information of all the entities which are added into the context object, right? Not only it is going to give the state of the student entity, but also it is going to give you the information of the standard, student address, course, right? Courses means you will find two entities in the courses because it's a collection purpose. So every entity information is going to return by this method, right? And you can get the name, right? What is the entity name? And then what is the entity state? You can access like this, right? So later I will show you how to set the entity graph into the database, right? Now you will see some of the entities are going to be in added state, but right, the main entity is going to be in added state, but the standard student address courses, it might be in a different state, right? So let me run this application, right? So student entity is in added state, standard added, student address added, course entity added, courses entity state added, right? So in this case, it is adding the entity in the added state, right? So in this case, what I'm providing, I'm not providing the course name, right? Let me remove this one, right? So now run the application again, right? So all are in added state. Yes, right. So all entities are in added state. Why it is added state? Because we have set the entity state as added right now. So if you set the entity state as added for the parent entity, the child entity state are going to be in added states. If you set the entity state, parent entity state as modified, the child entity state is going to be unchanged. If you set the entity state as deleted, the child entity state is going to be modified or unchanged, right? So in this case, added is there, right? Let me set this as modified and see what will happen to the child entities, right? So in this case, the parent entity is going to be in modified state, but the rest of all are going to be in unchanged state, right? So let me add the delete also, right? Deleted. And in this case, you will see some of them are in unchanged and some of them are in modified, right? So what it means if you are using the this entry method, right, then you have to take care not only the parent entity, but also you need to set the appropriate entity state for the child entities. Otherwise, your application behave is going to be differently, right? For added case, that is fine, right? But in the case of added, right, if you see the standard ID is already exist, right? And here, right, so it should not be going to create, it should be modify this information in the standard table, right? So this is student address. This course ID means this is a existing course ID. In this case, it is should create a new course because ID is not provided, right? That means based on the key column value, I need to identify whether it is a new one or it is a exist one. In this case, student ID is not exist, means the student ID is not exist in the database. So it is going to create a new student. If the student ID is present, then it should not create a new student. Instead, it should update that student, right? And this is the reason why. And in that scenarios, right, situations like this, primary key will come into the picture, right? So if you are going with entry method, then don't, not only you have to taken care of the parent entity, definitely you are going to set the state of the parent entity, right? No doubt about it, but you have to taken care of the child entities as well, right? So you have to set the appropriate state of each child entities. If you are not setting, then the behavior is going to be different. Now, how we will set the child state entities appropriately, properly, we'll see that after some time, right? So this is the entry method, how you can use the entry method to track the disconnected entities. Clear? So you just need to pass the disconnected entity to the entry method and you need to set the steps. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So another option is division.add method. We have already discussed this thing. In this case, what it will do, it will not only add the child entities, but also the parent entities into the added state, right? So this is my disconnected student. I'm setting the student address. I'm setting the standard. I'm setting the courses. I'm creating the context object. I'm attaching this disconnected entity to this context object, right? So once I attach the disconnected entity to the context object using the add method, so in this case, not only the parent entity, right, this student, right, but also the student address, standard, and the course, right, all entities are going to be added in the added state. And if you want to check the state of each entity, then you have to use the context dot change tracker dot entities. This change tracker property will give you the tracking information of all the entities which are tracked by this context object, right? So now let me run the application, and in this case you will see all the entities are going to be in added state, right? So you can see added, and added, right? Clear? So using this add method, you cannot set the entity state as a modified, entity state as a deleted. Add means it is only going to set the entity state as added. Clear?
Okay.
Right? So if you are sure that I'm going to add the entities in the added state only, right, then you need to use this add method. But if you want to set the entity state as modified, deleted, added, then you have to use the first option what we discussed, that is entry method, right? Now another option is that attach. So this attach method is also going to do the same thing, but in this case the state is not going to be attached, right? So in this case the state is going to be unchanged, right? Let me run the application and show you the output. Right? So every state is going to be unchanged, and again, and later it is going, if you are updating, modifying, doing any kind of things, that is going to be tracked by the entity object, right? So if you are sure that my application should track the context object should track the main entity as well as child entities using the unchanged state, then you have to use this attach method. If you are sure that the context object should track my main entity on as well as my related entities, right? In the form of added state, then you have to use the add method, right? And if you want to set the entity state manually, right? Manually in the sense you want to set some of the state as added, some of the state as modified, some of the state as deleted, right? And then you need to go with the entry method, right? And and in entry method, you have to set the entity state manually, not only for the parent entity, but it is also recommended to use set the child entity states, right? Now, one question is when to use disconnected entities. In most of the single tier application, right? If you are developing one single tier application, right, the user interface layer and the data access layer both host and run on the same server, and we generally perform the database CRUD operation or entities that are being tracked by the context object, right? If you are developing a single tier application, that means you can perform everything in the same application, right? So, but if you are developing an entire application, right, then what will happen? In entire application, user interface layer is one, business logic layer is a different one, data access layer is a different one. And in that case, so data access layer will retrieve the data from the database, and data access layer will return that data to the business layer. And the business layer is going to modify the data showing in the UI, taking input from the UI, modifying the logic data, right? Everything. And once it modify the data, again, it will hand over the data to the database layer, right? And again, the database layer need to track the state of the entities, right? And in that scenario, you need to work with the disconnected entities, right? But guys, can anybody tell me what is the difference between 3-layer and a 3-tier architecture? It is one of the interview questions. Can anybody tell me what is the difference between 3-layer and a 3-tier architecture?
3-tier in the sense there will be 3 projects which is
Sorry?
independently. 3-tier means there will be 3 independent projects that can be deployed in each servers, in 3 servers.
Exactly. Right?
3 layers, yeah, 3-layer, it will be a MVC pattern like that, model view controller. So it will be communicated.
Right. You are right, but a little bit in knowledge you need to remember, right? Suppose I'm not working with the MVC kind of application, but I'm having one a project for a presentation layer. I'm having one project for business layer, and I'm having one project for data access layer. This is not, you can consider MVC or you can consider this as a separate project, right? So this is a project, right? Presentation layer project, and this is business layer project, and this is data access layer project, right? So in this case, presentation layer will be interacting with the business logic layer. Business layer is interacting with the data access layer. So 3 different projects. And now you are hosting this project in your server 1, right? So you are hosting this application in server 1 also. You are hosting the server application in server 1. So this is nothing but your 3-layer 1-tier architecture, right? So now I'm showing you, this is server 1, this is server 2, and this is server 3. This is 3-layer and 3-tier architecture, right? So this is your 3-layer. This is also your 3-layer, but you cannot say this is a 3-tier. You have to say this is a 1-tier. Why? Because even though you have different projects, you are hosting all the 3 different projects into the same server. And here you are deploying this project into 3 different servers, right? Clear?
Yes.
So here it means your project presentation layer, business layer, and your data layer, all are, all are into a single project and deployed onto the single server, right? So in this case, this is going to be a completely, right, even though they are having different layer, it is treated as a single project, right? And deployed on the server. Deployed on the server, right? So, and in this case, you are having 3 different machines to server the 3 different projects. In this case, to deploy the 3 different projects, you are using a single machine, and here to deploy 3 different projects, you are using 3 different machines, right? So this machine, right, will decide whether it is a 1-tier or it is a 3-tier, right? So in most of the cases, right, this data access layer will interact with the database to get the data, and it will hand over the data to the business layer. Business layer doing some business operations, business some calculation, manipulation, all these things are going to happen. Then this business layer will hand over the data to the UI layer, or this presentation layer, or you can say UI layer. UI layer will represent the data to the user. The user can input something, can modify something, right? And then those modification will again come to the business layer, and business layer will check the validation and all these things, right? Appropriate business logics, and after modifying the data, it will hand over the data to the data layer. And whenever the data will come to the data layer doesn't have any idea about the state of the entity. That means for now, for the context object, whatever data it is receiving, right, it is a disconnected entity. Then this disconnected entity, how you are going to handle, that is what you need to understand, right? So now you understand what are disconnected entities and when it will come into the picture,
Yes.
right? Right, now we'll see how we are going to do this thing, right? Suppose you are having, right, disconnected entities, then how you are going to save those disconnected entities, that is what we are going to discuss now, right? So we know how to attach the disconnected entities. Now we are going to see how we are going to save those disconnected entity into the database, right? So basically how we are going to set, right? So attaching, you can attach the disconnected entity using the entry method, right? Using the add method, using the attach method, right? So you are having three. So if you are adding the entity using the add and the attach method, then by default the entity state it is going to set as added and the modified, right? Added and unchanged, right? But if you want to set the entity state manually, right, then you have to use the entry method, right? Then how we are going to use that entry method, that is what we need to understand, right? So for each entity there is a primary key column, right? If you go to the database table, right, for each entity, right, for each database table there is a primary key column, and for each primary key column there is a corresponding property in the each entity. So in this case, student ID is the primary key column property. If you go to student standard table, this is the primary key column property. If you go to the teacher entity, then you will see this is the primary key column property, right? And based on that primary key column property, we need to set the appropriate entity state. If that key value equals to 0, right, primary key means, see, so not only that key, so it might be possible that some of the time you might be created the primary key column using integer data type. Some of the time it might be possible that you created the primary key column using the string data type, string in the sense in database it might be varchar, right? That means, so if the primary key column, let's assume if it is an integer and if its value is 0, means that entity is added in the database or not, guys? If
Oh,
I'm
no.
creating one student entity and the student object and the student ID is 0, 0 means what? Is that student entity exist in the database or not?
No.
No. If the student entity not exist in the database, if the key value is equals to 0, then you have to set the entity state as added. I'm creating one student entity and the student ID is 2. If the student ID is 2, it means that student entity is exist in the database or not?
Not necessarily.
Sorry?
Maybe.
Not maybe, in this case it should be, because you are retrieving the data from the database using a different context object, right?
Oh, okay, okay,
In that
okay.
case,
Yeah,
that
right,
case,
sorry, yeah.
right, that entity state should be there, right? If it is greater than 0, means the entity state is that entity is exist in the database, and if it exists, then you have to set the state as modified. Let's assume that you are taking a string key, right? If you are taking a string key, then what is the default value of string? Null. If the value is null, means that entity is not exist in the database, you have to set the entity state as added. If the entity value is some value is there, it is not null, right? Then that means that entity is exist, then you have to set the entity state as modified. And whenever you call the save changes method, if the state is added, then it is going to generate the insert SQL query. And if the state is modified, then it is going to generate the update SQL story, and that insert update statement is going to be deleted from the database, right? And for delete, you do not need to do anything special, right? You just need to set the state as deleted, and that is going to be deleted from the database, right? In for delete case, you do not need to check the entity state, right? You do not need to check the key value, whether the key is 0 or 1 like this, right? If the key, so delete means delete. If the entity is exist in the database, right, then it will mark the entity state as deleted. And when you call the save changes method, it is going to delete from the database. If the entity is only exist in the context object, but not in the database, then it is going to delete that entity from the context object and will mark the state as detached. And for that case, no SQL script is going to be generated because that entity is not exist in the database. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right now, let us see some of the examples so that you will get a better idea, right? So we have already discussed how to attach. I'm not going to show you the add method and the attach method. I'm going to show you the example using the TP entry method, right? TP context entry method. So in this case, so first of all, I'm going to show you the example using simple entity. Then I will show you example using the entity graph, right? So in this case, this is not an entity graph. This is a simple entity. Why? Because in this case, the related entities are not included, right? So here I'm using the database log method to check whether the what SQL statement is generated by entity framework for this context object, right? When the save changes method is called, right? So now if you check this entity, do I have set the entity state? Sorry, do I have set the student ID? Guys, am I set the student ID for this new disconnected student entity?
No.
Then what is the default value of student
Add.
ID? Sorry?
Null. It will be 0. Sorry, null. It will be null.
Why it will be null? What is the type? Student ID type is integer. What is the
zero.
value of integer?
It's 0.
0. If I am using standard ID, then it will be stored null because it is a nullable type. But in this case, it is not a nullable type. So not nullable means it is going to store the value 0. So what I'm using here, right? I'm using the context.entry method. I'm passing that new disconnected entity object. I'm setting the state. How I'm setting the state? Please observe. So I'm basically using the ternary operator. And here I'm checking if the student ID equals to 0. If this condition is satisfied, please set the state as added. If not, then you have to set the state as modified. Clear?
Yeah, enjoy.
Right. So in this case, you can see before save changes, right? So before calling the save changes method, what is the entity state? And after calling the save changes method, what is the entity state? That is what I'm showing here, right? So what is the entity? Stephen Smith, right? Let me run the application. Right. So you can see this is the insert statement generated by the entity framework, right? Now, if you go to the database, currently Stephen Smith is not there, right? So now you can see Stephen Smith is added into the collection, into the database student table. So this is how you can add a disconnected entity, not entity graph. I'm again saying this is not a graph, entity graph. This is a disconnected entity into the database. Clear, guys? Right? So now I'm going to show you another example. Right. So you can fetch the context object, right? So in this case, I'm fetching the data. Okay, let me do one thing, right? If you are getting confused, I'm making some changes, right? So context dot variable. Right. So Yeah, you can leave. So this session will be take at least another 30 minutes. So those who wants to leave, they can leave. Context dot. Okay. Context dot students dot find method. I'm passing the value, right? And then what I'm trying to do, student dot first name equals to fn1, right? And then I'm making the changes. Last name equals to ln2. Right. So now that's fine. Right. So now you can see. Right. So now you can see two things you need to remember, right? So using the one context object, right? Okay. I'm fetching the student data. I'm storing the inside this variable, and I'm changing the first name and the last name, right? And whose details we are changing? We are changing the student whose ID is 1. Then I'm using that same context object here, right? I'm setting the state, right? Now, in this case, this context object having the student ID or not? Guys,
Yeah, having.
having means the value should not be 0. So in this case, what it should set the state of the entity?
Modified.
Right, modified. And whenever we call the set changes method, it is going to generate insert statement or update statement.
Update.
Update, right? Let me run the application. Rising, please speak, because I'm not going to check the message regularly, right? So be participate and be say yes, no, and any question you can take. Don't put that yes, no, all these things in the chatting, because I'm not going to check those chat messages, right? So you can see the statement is before update, right? Before step changes, the state has modified, and after it is going to answer. This is what we have already seen. But here the important thing is it is generating the update SQL statement, right? So this is how you can set the entity state, right? Now we'll see how to delete one disconnected entity, right? So basically, what exactly my requirement is, I have added a new entity. What is the state of that entity? 24. So what I'm saying, I'm just creating one new object with the ID 24. Only the student ID is enough, because it is going to delete the student, right, based on the ID value, right, the primary key column value. So this is my disconnected entity, right? And in this case, I'm setting the entity state as deleted. And once I set this entity state as deleted, right? If this disconnected entity, right, is only available in the context object, not available in the database, then it is going to delete from the context object and the state will be detached. If it is available in the database, right? Again, I'm saying if it is available in the database, right, then it is going to, what I can say, it is going to remove from the database, right, by using the delete SQL query. So in this case, student ID 24 is available in the database. So it is going to generate the delete SQL statement when I'm calling this changes method, right? So now let me run the application. And in this case, you do not need to check the ID whether greater than 0, less than 0, nothing is required. You can simply call this delete method. You can see before deleted and after delete, the state is moved to detached. Clear, guys? Clear or any question?
Yes, yes. No, it's okay.
Yeah, so this is fine. Now we need to understand how to use disconnected entity graph, right? So working with a simple entity is not that difficult. It will be become difficult whenever we are going to use the disconnected entity graph, right? So let us see one example. With the example, I will explain you the code, right? Right. So here you can see I'm creating one student object, right? And I'm not providing the student ID. That means it is going to be a new student object. But here you can see standard, I'm providing the standard ID. If the standard ID is exists, right? That means if you go to the definition, what is the primary key column? Standard ID. If the standard ID one I'm providing here means it is an existing entity or it is a new entity.
Existing.
Exist.
And in this case, come to this courses, right? Course name, course ID is not exist. That means it is going to be a new one. And here course ID is exist. This is means it is one existing entity. So right now with this student object, I'm attaching the standard and the courses, right? Directly, you cannot assign the student address because student address and the student table having one-to-one relationship. So first of all, you need to generate the student ID, and once the student ID is generated, then you can attach that student ID with the student address table. So first of all, you need to create the student variable, student object. The student object is created, right? Then I'm attaching the student address, and in this student address property, right, I'm creating a new instance of student address, and here the student ID is nothing but the student ID, because the student address table student ID is pointing to the student table student ID column, right? So in this case, this is going to be a new entity, right? Why? Because the student ID in this case is going to be 0. 0 means that is not existing in the database. So it is going to create a new student address, right? So now we need to set the entity state. So again, I'm saying if you are using entity graph, then you should set the entity state manually for not only the parent entity, but for all child entities, right? So in this case, you can see I'm setting the student entity state. If student ID equals to 0, it is going to be added state, else it is going to be in modified state. Then I'm going to set the student dot standard. So you cannot simply pass standard because this standard property belongs to the student object only. So student dot standard. So what is the standard property? If you check standard, if standard ID equals to 0, then it is going to be new, else it is going to be a updated one. So student dot standard ID equals to 0. No, it is if it is equals to 0 added. If it is not equals to 0, then the state is going to be modified, right? And then if you see the courses, right? So in courses, we have attached the standard, we have attached the student address, right? Now we need to check the courses. In courses, we are having two entities, right? So directly we cannot set. So we need to loop through the courses entity, right? So here I'm looping through the courses property, and then for each course, I'm setting the state, right? So I'm just checking if the course ID, right? What is the course ID value? If it is equals to 0, then it is going to be added. And if it is not equals to 0, then the state is going to be modified. And in this case, it might be possible you are having two courses, three courses, one courses, a collection of courses. So you have to use the for each loop, right? So once you set the state of each entity, right? A parent entity as well as child entity, right? So we have not set the state. Where is the standard student address, right? Student address is missing, right? Set the student address. So here you need to write student address, right? Standard student address dot what is the name? Student ID. All right. So in this case, it is going to be added or updated, right? So we have set the state for student, we have set the state for student standard, we have set the state for student address, and we have set the state for each courses entity, right? And then if you want to check what is the state of each entity, before shape changes, you can use this change tracker.entries method. Once you call the shape changes method, then you will see, right, for each update, right, for each entity based on the state, it is going to generate either insert SQL query or update SQL query, right? And then it is going to use, and after the step changes, if you want to check the state of each entity, then again you can use this for each loop, right? Now let me run the application. Right, so you can see, so it is saying entity state, okay, student added, student address, course entity state added, standard modified, and one of the course as modified. See, if you see in two courses, right, if you see, let's start with the courses. One of the course having the ID value and other one is not having the ID value. So one of the course is in added state, another course is in modified state, right? Now, if you go to the standard, it is having the ID value. So it is going to be in modified state. So where is standard modified, right? Now, if you come to the student address, so this student ID, in this case, the value is 0. 0 means it is going to be in added state and student entity is added state, right? Now you can see for the course, one of the course, right, it is using the update statement. For the standard, right, it is using the update statement, right? After the two update statements are performed, right, then you can see it is using the insert for course, it is using insert for student, right? It is using insert for student address, it is using insert for student course, and it is using, and then you can see there is a student course table, right? If you see, we are having some student course table, and there it is automatically inserting the data, right? So if you remember, we are having the student course table. What is the link? The link is that it is going to keep the student and the corresponding course. So now we are adding one student with the two courses. So you can see the student ID 2525 and one of the course ID is 1, another course ID is 10, right? So automatically this information will be stored inside this table. Right? Any question from anyone? Guys,
No.
clear?
Yes, actually, I am having one question, not from this example, some a basic question. Can I know the difference between the data set and then DB set?
Data set and the DB set.
Yeah.
So first of all, you just tell me why you are comparing data set and the DB set. Data set belongs to ADO.NET only,
Yes.
right? Data set means it is a collection of a database tables.
Yeah, that's correct. Actually, in the
And
data set,
and
we
it-
are holding. Yeah, tell me.
Yeah, so if you are retrieving one, suppose you are using ADO.NET, right? And in ADO.NET, if you are making one storage procedure or you are passing one, you are passing some SQL query, right? Which is returning you multiple data, multiple select statement, right? For each select statement, it is going to create a separate data table. If your query contains two select statement, then it is the data set is going to create two data tables, right? So data set is nothing but it's a collection of table, and the data table is going to store the select query result, right? And in this case, and in the case of a data set, right, it is nothing but data set is a collection of your entities, right? So if you go to the context class, right, then you will see this is the DB set, right? This
DB set,
DB
yes.
set is nothing but it's a collection of entities where each entity pointing to a database table, right? So in this case, it is not the result of a select query, right? So in this case, in this case, these courses, you cannot store some other information. So whatever database table structure, the same data you can store here, right?
Okay.
But in the case of a data table, say data set, you can define the one structure.
Okay.
One structure in the sense, if you want two table data inside, right? Suppose you are creating some joining operation, right? In that joining operation, you are fetching some 3 column from table 1, 2 column from table 2, total 5 column. Then you can store those 5 column inside a data table or inside a data set. But this is not possible here. right? Here, if you are using courses means it is only going to store the courses table data. No more additional column or no more nothing else. Right? So
Okay.
it is clear.
Yeah, it's clear now.
Any question from anyone related to today's session?
No.
Okay. So tomorrow we are going to discuss some asynchronous programming using your entity framework, and I would suggest please read that async await operator concept, asynchronous programming, why we need, right, before starting tomorrow's session, because that is important. And apart from that, we are going to start bulk insert, bulk update, and bulk delete operation using entity framework. So that is what we are going to discuss tomorrow. First, we will discuss asynchronous programming, then we will discuss bulk operations using entity framework. Clear, guys?
Okay.
Yes, sir.
And guys, from next week, right? From next week, I'm on leave, right? So I'm on a vacation. So if possible, then I will take the classes using my mobile internet, but not possible to upload the videos on the Telegram group, right? Because for uploading, it required many data. And as I'm traveling, so I could not have that in Wi-Fi facility. So I'm going to, if possible, I'm going to take the classes using my mobile network, but not possible to upload the videos on the Telegram group. And I will be on leave till Jan 2, right? So I'm going outside. I will take the classes, but when and how frequently I'm going to take the classes, that I cannot say, because it's basically depend on the internet, high internet speed, right? And what exactly in what situation I'm, right? So, but I will take the classes, but I will not upload the videos. In this week, I'm going to upload the video, but from next week, I'm talking about. Right? That's fine.
Maybe we all go on vacation.
Yeah, this is the reason why I'm saying that this is the time for vacation. So, and I'm not going to take the classes regularly, right? Mostly I will take the classes till 24th, but from 25th to January, 1st January, I think we need to take the, we need to give a break to this course, right? So because most of the people at that time are on vacation.
Agree.
Thank you guys.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.